The final slam of the oak door sounded like a judge's gavel. Ilara stood on the porch of the house her husband had built, a house that was no longer hers. In her left hand she clutched a folded deed, its paper thin and brittle. In her right, her fingers curled around the 20 silver dollars her brother-in-law, Elias, had pressed into her palm. He had called it a kindness. She felt the insult of it like a brand. Her 2 children, 6-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Sam, huddled against her skirts, their small faces pale with a confusion that would soon curdle into fear. Behind the closed door was the life she had known, the smell of baking bread, the worn spot on the floorboards where her husband John used to sit and mend harnesses, the warmth of the great stone hearth. Now the warmth was gone. John was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through Silver Creek like a phantom thief in the night. And with him, it seemed, had gone every claim she had to decency and home. Elias, his face a mask of grim duty, had been clear. The farm belonged to the bloodline. A widow and her children were a burden the family would not carry. The deed was for a parcel of land 2 days' walk north, a place the locals had a name for. They called it the Scab. It was a worthless knob of granite on the edge of the territories, wind-scoured and treeless, with a shallow cave that was more a rumor than a shelter. It was a place you sent things you wanted to forget. Elias had presented it as a magnanimous gift, a piece of family land for her to start anew. The assembled family members, aunts and uncles who had once praised her pies and stitching, nodded in solemn agreement. Their eyes, however, told a different story. They were looking at a ghost already. She had $20, a threadbare wool blanket, a single iron pot, and the clothes on their backs. Lily clutched a wooden doll John had carved for her. Sam held tight to his mother's hand. The community of Silver Creek watched from their windows as she stood there, a solitary island in the dust of the main road. Mr. Gable, the mercantile owner, stepped out onto his porch, stroking his beard. He offered no help, only a look of profound, unshakable pity. It was worse than scorn. It implied her fate was already written, her failure a foregone conclusion. He expected her to take the stagecoach east, to surrender to charity in a larger town. But Ilara did not look toward the stagecoach depot. She looked north toward the jagged line of the mountains that bit at the sky. A cold resolve settled in her bones, heavy and solid as river stone. She would not be an object of pity. She would not be a beggar. That worthless deed in her hand was the only thing on earth she could call her own. She would go to it, she would stand on it, and she would not be moved. She spent 5 of her precious dollars at Gable's Mercantile, not on a ticket, but on a good felling axe, a small sack of flour, and a packet of salt. Gable shook his head as he took her money, the sad, knowing look in his eyes making her stomach clench. He thought she was buying the tools of her own demise. The journey was a punishment. The road dissolved into a deer trail, then nothing at all. The weight of the axe and the pot was a constant biting presence, and carrying Sam when his small legs gave out made her muscles scream in protest. Lily walked with a silent, stoic determination that broke her mother's heart. The landscape grew harsher with every step, the gentle rolling hills of Silver Creek giving way to sharp rocks and stunted, wind-twisted pines. The air grew thinner, colder. They were walking away from the world. On the second day they saw it, a gray, ugly hump of granite rising from the earth like a blister. The Scab. It was worse than the stories. The wind howled across its surface with a sound like a grieving animal, a constant, relentless pressure that stole the warmth from their bodies and the breath from their lungs. There were no trees to speak of, only a few skeletal husks clinging to life in the crevices. The ground was stone and gravel, promising nothing. The cave was little more than a dark mouth in the side of the rock, a shallow scoop that offered scant protection from the wind. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of decay and cold stone. It went back no more than 20 feet before ending in a wall of solid rock. Alara dropped her meager supplies. The iron pot hit the stone floor with a clang that echoed the hollowness in her chest. This was it. This was her inheritance, a hole in a rock at the edge of nowhere. The town was right. Elias was right. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. She sank to the ground, pulling her children close, the tears she had refused to shed in Silver Creek finally freezing on her cheeks. For a long, dark moment, she believed they had come here only to die. Lily shivered, her small body trembling against her mother's. Sam began to cry, a thin, exhausted wail. It was the sound of her son's distress that pierced through Alara's despair. She got to her feet, her movements stiff. She had to make a fire. She had to do something. She ran her hand along the back wall of the cave, her fingers tracing the cold, damp seams in the rock, looking for anything, any small ledge or crack. And then she felt it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A faint, deep vibration in the stone, and something else, a lack of chill. While the rest of the cave wall was icy to the touch, one narrow vertical fissure felt not cold. It wasn't warm, not yet, but it was as if the deepest winter frost had not reached this single seam. Curiosity replacing despair, she pressed her cheek against the rock. Deep within the granite, she felt it again, a steady, low hum of energy, and with it, a gentle, persistent warmth. It was the deep, slow breath of the earth itself. Geothermal heat, bleeding up from the planet's core through this one deep fault line. It was a secret. The worthless place had a secret. A flicker of hope, fierce and defiant, ignited in the cold darkness of the cave. The work began at dawn the next day. It was a brutal, relentless assault on the rock and her own body. Her first task was to widen the opening of the cave, which was too exposed to the wind. She used the axe not for wood, but as a lever, prying loose massive chunks of weathered granite from the cliff face. She dragged them one by one, her hands raw and bleeding, to form the foundation of a wall. Her muscles, accustomed to housework and gardening, burned and tore. Blisters formed on her palms, broke, and bled onto the axe handle. She ignored the pain, wrapping her hands in strips torn from her petticoat. Days blurred into a cycle of raw, physical exertion. She felled the few dead, twisted pines on the property, learning the rhythm of the axe, the bite of the blade, the satisfying crack of splitting wood. She was not a carpenter, but she learned. She learned to notch the logs with clumsy, uneven cuts. She learned to roll them into place atop her stone foundation, her body a simple machine of leverage and will. She needed mortar, and she found it in a deposit of clay near a small seep at the base of the hill. She mixed it with water and gravel, packing it into the gaps between the stones and logs, her fingers caked and stiff. The wall rose, inch by painful inch, a testament to pure, unyielding effort. While the outer wall took shape, her mind was focused on the secret inside, the warmth. She used a heavy log as a battering ram, striking the fissure at the back of the cave again and again until the rock splintered. Behind it was not a solid wall, but a narrow, hollow chimney of sorts, a natural vent reaching deep into the earth. The air that flowed from it was warm and humid, a steady, reliable source of heat. This was the heart of her home. She would not block it. She would harness it. She began constructing a low, hollow wall of flat stones leading from the vent, snaking it across the floor of the cave. It was a crude hypocaust, a Roman idea she'd read about once in a tattered book. The hot air would flow through the stone channels, warming the floor and the very air of the room before escaping through a smaller secondary fissure she had discovered near the ceiling. Water was the next challenge. The seep at the base of the hill was unreliable. But inside the cave she noticed a constant, slow drip of condensation near the warm vent. It was clean, pure water, filtered through 100 feet of granite. She dug a shallow basin into the rock floor directly beneath it, a task that took 4 days of chipping away with the sharp edge of a stone. She then lined the basin with the same clay she used for mortar, smoothing it with wet hands and letting it harden. It was a small cistern, barely larger than a wash basin, but it filled slowly, steadily. A cup of clean water, then 2, then a gallon. It was life. Food was the final piece. Nothing could grow on the barren exterior, but inside, with the constant warmth and moisture, she saw a possibility. She spent a week hauling soil from a sheltered, nutrient-rich pocket of earth she found a 1/4 mile away. She carried it in her apron, load after painstaking load, until she had created a raised bed 3 feet wide and 10 feet long in the warmest part of the cave, right against the heated stone channel. It was a subterranean garden, a place of impossible life. Into this dark, rich earth she would plant the seeds she planned to buy. After a month of this solitary labor, she knew she had to return to Silver Creek. She needed things she could not build: chickens for eggs, a goat for milk, seeds for her hidden garden, more salt to preserve whatever she could hunt or forage. She left the children with a small fire and a stern warning, and made the 2-day journey back to the world that had cast her out. Walking into Gable's Mercantile was like stepping into a bad dream. The pot-bellied stove radiated its familiar heat, but the faces that turned to look at her were cold. She was gaunt, her face browned by the wind, her hands scarred and calloused. Her dress was torn and stained with dirt and clay. She was a wild thing. Mr. Gable's jaw went slack. He had expected to hear she was dead, not to see her standing before him, asking to buy a pregnant nanny goat. "A goat?" he stammered, his voice loud in the silent store. "Woman, what in God's name are you doing out there?" "I'm building a home," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. The whispers started then, a rustle of speculation and mockery from the men gathered by the stove. "Cave girl," one of them muttered. "The widow's folly." She ignored them, her gaze fixed on Gable. She bought 2 laying hens, the goat, seeds for carrots, potatoes, and hardy greens, and another 10 pounds of salt. The purchases drained her remaining funds down to the last dollar. As she was tying a lead rope to the goat, Elias walked in. He stopped dead, his face a mixture of shock and contempt. "Still playing at survival, are you, Alara?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Winter will change your mind." He looked at the goat and laughed, a short, ugly sound. "That animal will be frozen solid by first snow. You're a fool." Alara met his gaze. She did not argue. She did not explain. She simply said, "This land is mine, Elias." She turned and led her small procession of animals out of the store and back toward the wilderness. The journey back was even harder, coaxing and pulling a stubborn goat and carrying 2 squawking chickens. But every step away from Silver Creek felt like a victory. A week after her return, as she was chinking the final gaps in her outer wall, a scrawny, dust-colored dog appeared at the edge of her clearing. It was ribs and fur, with 1 torn ear and wary eyes. She left out a bowl of water and a scrap of salted meat. The dog watched her for a full day before creeping forward to eat. It never left. Sam named him Boulder for his stillness. He became their shadow, their guardian, his low growl the first warning of any approaching creature. He was the final piece of their small, defiant family. The whispers from Silver Creek became a story, a piece of local folklore. They called her home the Widow's Hole. The name was a weapon meant to mock her grief and her foolishness. Trappers who passed nearby would sometimes climb the ridge to stare down at the strange stone and log facade she had built into the rock, shaking their heads at the madness of it. One of them, a burly man named Brant, even came down to her door. He offered condescending advice, telling her she'd never survive the winter, that her chimney would clog with snow, that the wolves would get her livestock. Alara listened patiently, her hand resting on Boulder's head. When he was finished, she simply thanked him for his concern and closed the heavy insulated door she had built from 2 layers of pine packed with dried moss. She did not need his approval. She had the steady warmth from the floor, the slow drip of water into her cistern, and the quiet companionship of her children and her dog. As autumn bled into winter, life in the widow's hole settled into a deep, quiet routine. The world outside grew hard and cold, but inside their sealed cavern it was always spring. The geothermal heat kept the air at a constant, comfortable temperature. Their days were marked by simple, essential tasks. In the mornings, Ilara would milk the goat, its warm, rich milk a daily miracle. Lily would feed the chickens, who clucked contentedly in a small pen built against the warmest wall. Sam's job was to check the cistern, his face lighting up as he announced how much water had collected overnight. The underground garden thrived. Shielded from the killing frosts, lit by the weak winter sun that filtered through 2 small windows made of thinly scraped mica, the carrots and potatoes grew deep in the dark soil. Hardy greens provided a constant source of fresh food, a shocking luxury in the dead of winter. The air smelled of damp earth, wood smoke from the small cooking fire, and the clean scent of the animals. It was the smell of a self-contained world, a world Ilara had built with her own 2 hands. At night they would sit on woolen blankets spread over the warm stone floor. Ilara would tell her children stories, not of princes and castles, but of clever animals and resourceful women. They were stories of survival, of finding a way when there was no way. They had their first real test in late November. A pack of wolves, driven by hunger from the high country, found their scent. They circled the shelter for 2 nights, their howls echoing off the granite. Boulder stood sentry at the door, a constant low growl rumbling in his chest. Lily and Sam were terrified, but Ilara was calm. She checked the heavy bar on the door, inspected the mortar in the stone walls. The shelter was a fortress. The wolves could not get in. On the 3rd day they gave up and moved on. The small victory solidified Ilara's trust in her creation. The walls held. The door was strong. They were safe. Then came the blizzard of '83. It did not arrive like a normal storm. It descended like a judgment. The sky turned a bruised, metallic gray, and the wind began to scream. It was a physical presence, a solid wall of force that tore at the very fabric of the world. It was followed by the cold, a deep, predatory cold that felt like a living thing. It was not the familiar chill of winter. It was a cold that broke thermometers, a cold that froze running water solid in an instant, a cold that shattered trees like glass. In Silver Creek, the community's confidence shattered with the temperature. Their well-built log cabins, the pride of the frontier, were no match for this level of cold. The frost crept through the chinking like a disease, coating the inside walls with a thick, white fur. Fireplaces that had always been sufficient now devoured wood at an impossible rate, roaring day and night just to keep the cold at bay. Families burned through their entire winter stockpiles in a matter of days. The town's infrastructure collapsed. The roof of the meeting hall groaned and then splintered under the impossible weight of the snow, which was as dense and heavy as sand. Mr. Gable's store, the center of the community, had its great front windows burst inward by the pressure of the wind, showering his goods with ice and snow. Barns became tombs, the livestock frozen solid where they stood. The safe, conventional way of life, the one they had mocked Ilara for abandoning, was failing. People were freezing in their homes. The town was dying. Inside the widow's hole, there was only peace. The storm was a distant, theoretical thing, a muffled roar beyond their stone walls. The geothermal heat, indifferent to the weather, kept the floor warm and the air mild. The goat chewed its cud, the chickens scratched in their pen, and the green shoots in the garden continued their slow, quiet reach toward the mica windows. Ilara stoked the small cooking fire, the smoke drawn cleanly up the natural fissure in the rock. She was not fighting the storm. She and her children were simply outside its reach, living in the gentle, stable warmth of the deep earth. On the fourth night of the blizzard, as the wind howled like a legion of banshees, Boulder suddenly rose to his feet, a sharp, urgent bark ripping through the calm of the cave. He stood at the door, hackles raised, whining with agitation. Ilara quieted the children and listened. Over the roar of the storm she heard it, a faint, desperate pounding on the outside of the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one should be out in this. No one could survive it. With immense effort, she lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled the door inward. A figure, completely encased in snow and ice, fell into the room, collapsing onto the warm stone floor. It was a woman. As the snow melted from her face, Ilara gasped. It was Sarah, Elias's wife. Sarah was half-conscious, her lips blue, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Please," she whispered, her voice a frozen rasp. "My boy, David, the fever, our cabin, the fire is out. Elias went for help. He didn't come back." She dissolved into a fit of desperate, body-racking coughs. Ilara stood frozen for a moment, the memory of Elias's mocking laughter in the mercantile echoing in her mind. This was the family that had thrown her out, that had left her and her children for dead. A bitter, cold part of her wanted to shut the door and let the storm have them all. She looked at Sarah, shuddering on the floor. She looked at her own children, their faces wide with fear, but safe, warm, fed. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a duty. She was a mother. Sarah was a mother. That was the only thing that mattered. "Lily, watch Sam," she commanded, her voice steady. She pulled Sarah further from the door and wrapped her in their warmest blankets, forcing a cup of warm goat's milk between her lips. Then she began to prepare. She filled a small sled with stones she had heated by the cooking fire, wrapping them in layers of wool to hold their warmth. She added a jar of broth, more blankets, and a coil of rope. She pulled on the thickest coat she owned, a patchwork of rabbit skins she had stitched together. "Boulder," she said. The dog was already at her side, ready. She turned to Sarah. "I will bring him back." Stepping out into the storm was like stepping into a blender of ice and knives. The wind tore the breath from her lungs and tried to rip the sled from her hands. Visibility was zero. It was a world of pure roaring chaos. But Boulder knew the way. With his head down, he led her through the maelstrom, following a scent or an instinct that defied the senses. The journey to Elias's cabin, normally a 2-hour walk, took 4. It was a battle for every single step. She found the cabin half buried in a drift, a dark, silent lump in the white fury. The door was frozen shut. She used the head of her axe to smash it open. Inside was a scene from a nightmare. The cold was as intense as it was outside. The fire was long dead, a pile of gray ash. In a small bed, under a mountain of frozen blankets, was the boy, David. He was terrifyingly still, his skin gray, his breathing almost non-existent. She worked quickly, bundling him onto the sled, surrounded by the hot stones, forcing a few drops of warm broth into his mouth. She did not see any sign of Elias. He was lost to the storm. She secured the boy and turned back into the blizzard, following her dog back toward the one point of safety on Earth. When they stumbled back into the shelter, Ilara was nearly spent, her own body beginning to succumb to the cold. But seeing the small flicker of life in the boy's chest drove her on. She and Sarah stripped off his frozen clothes and wrapped him in warm blankets, placing him on the warmest part of the floor, directly over the stone channel. For hours they worked to bring him back, rubbing his limbs, spooning warm milk and broth into his mouth. Slowly, miraculously, a tinge of pink returned to his cheeks. His breathing deepened. He would live. Sarah watched this all in a state of stunned disbelief. Her eyes darted around the cavern, from the calm, sleeping animals to the impossible green of the garden, from the neat stack of firewood to the slow, steady drip of water into the cistern. The air was warm, alive, smelling of earth and food. This was not the dark, filthy hole she had imagined. This was not the widow's folly. This was a sanctuary. This was a miracle. She looked at Alara, her face streaked with tears of shame and gratitude. She could not find the words. 2 days later, the blizzard broke. The wind died and a weak, watery sun revealed a world transformed, buried under a monolithic blanket of white. It was then that another sound came to their door, the crunch of snowshoes and the shouting of men. A search party from Silver Creek, led by Mr. Gable, had been looking for Elias and his family. They had seen the thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the fissure high on the rock face, and had come to investigate. When Alara opened the door, Gable's jaw dropped. He stared at her, then at the impossible scene inside the cave. He saw Sarah, alive. He saw David, weak but sleeping peacefully. Just beyond the shelter, half buried in a drift, his men had found Elias, alive but suffering from severe frostbite. Gable stepped inside, his boots silent on the stone floor. He took in the warmth, the light, the order. He looked at the chickens, the goat, the garden. He looked at the faces of Alara's children, healthy and safe. He turned back to Alara, his face, which had only ever shown her pity, now filled with a profound and humbling awe. "We were wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The other men from the town crowded behind him, their faces a gallery of shock. "We called you a fool. We called this place the Widow's Hole." He shook his head, looking around the warm, life-filled space. "My God, we were the fools." Elias, carried inside by 2 men, his face a mask of pain and shame, heard him. He looked at his son, safe. He looked at his wife, alive. Then he looked at Alara, the woman his family had discarded. He tried to speak, but only a dry, broken sob escaped. Alara felt no triumph. She saw no enemies, only cold, hungry people. She simply nodded to the large pot of stew simmering over her cooking fire. "There is food," she said. "Eat." She moved to Elias and began to gently examine his frost-bitten hands and feet, her movements practical and sure. Her grace was her victory. She did not need to say a word. The warmth of her home, the food from her garden, the life she had sustained against all odds, it spoke for her. In the weeks after the Great Freeze, as Silver Creek thawed and began to count its terrible losses, the story spread. The legend of the Widow's Hole became the story of Heartstone Hollow. The name was no longer a mockery, but a title of respect, spoken with a sense of wonder. People no longer made the journey to her land to stare and whisper, but to learn. They came with questions, bringing gifts of lumber and tools, not as charity, but as trade for her knowledge. How had she harnessed the earth's heat? How had she found water? How had she grown food in the dark? Alara, quiet and unassuming, showed them. She explained the principles of thermal mass, of insulation, of passive heating. She showed them the clay she used for her cistern, the vent that served as her chimney. She did not hoard her knowledge, she gave it freely. The community that had cast her out now depended on her ingenuity for its own rebirth. Elias, when he recovered, was a changed man. Humbled and shamed, he publicly apologized to Alara, offering to give her back the main farm. She refused. Heartstone Hollow was her home, built not just of stone and wood, but of her own pain and perseverance. It was a part of her. The town rebuilt, but they rebuilt differently. New homes were dug into hillsides, foundations were made of thick stone to hold the day's heat, and people began to look at the landscape not as something to be conquered, but as a system to be understood. Years passed. The children grew, their laughter echoing in the warm, safe space their mother had carved from the rock. The shelter itself expanded with new rooms dug deeper into the granite, new systems perfected. It became a landmark, a testament to what one woman, stripped of everything but her own resolve, could accomplish. Travelers passing through the territory carried her story with them, a tale of resilience that became a new kind of frontier legend. Alara lived a long life in the hollow she had built. She never sought praise or power. Her satisfaction came from the quiet rhythms of her homestead, the health of her children, and the peaceful knowledge that she had faced the worst the world could offer and had not been broken. In the evenings she would often sit at the entrance of her home, watching the sun set over the mountains. She had been given a worthless piece of land, a place of mockery and despair. But she had listened to the earth, trusted her own hands, and from nothing she had built not just a shelter, but a life. Her legacy was written not in a history book, but in the warm stones of her home, a quiet, enduring monument to the unyielding strength of the human spirit.